Hi, my name is Marcy Gutierrez. This is my Masha 501 concept note. The title of my project is Higher Ground South Sudan. The applicant is Sustainability Corps. The situational, historical, political, and climate context in South Sudan have been significantly outlined and considered in the 2025 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. As many as 100 different organizations have been on the ground and in the field in South Sudan for many years. In 2024, approximately 72% of the population required humanitarian assistance. The root causes of the South Sudanese crises are flooding, drought, and extreme heat brought on by climate change, and these causes have not been adequately addressed. Increasingly frequent floods destroy homes, communities, and crops, leading to high food insecurity, malnutrition, intercommunal violence, and mass displacement. One particular reason the flooding is so devastating is that the clay silt soils do not drain. From the HNRP, it shows that 9.3 million people are in need, with 5.4 million people targeted. The CCM cluster report is addressing specific areas with 1.1 million people IDPs targeted, representing 78% of those particular regions. Efforts are being made not only to provide emergency relief assistance, but also durable solutions and build resilience. Land ownership and eviction further complicate access to secure, affordable housing, with prohibitive land costs making stability a distant goal. Flooding coincides with the cropping and the harvesting season, exacerbating food and nutrition insecurity. This leads to tensions and conflicts, resulting in violent clashes and triggering serious human rights violations, including widespread sexual violence, particularly against women and girls. This is the Bentiu IDP camp where approximately 100,000 people reside. It is an island in the floodwaters, protected by embankments which require continued maintenance. There are concerns about this camp and others about their long-term future and sustainability. South Sudan continues to experience extreme climate shocks that occur multiple times a year, giving the communities no time to recover. The cumulative effects of climate change create a situation of perennial vulnerability, wiping out local adaptive response mechanisms. This undermines the collective ability to provide pathways to solutions and has contributed to an over-reliance on humanitarian assistance, and communities are unable to recover and make progress. Women face huge challenges: high maternal mortality, lower adult literacy, and are only represented with 32% of the seats in parliament. Almost all women who do work in the informal sector. Women and girls bear the disproportionate impacts from climate change threats and the violence that results. Truly disruptive transformations, by definition, are an abrupt departure from the current ways of working in all of the sectors. In architecture, for instance, there are design competitions. A problem is articulated and criteria is given. Teams put together proposals and submit designs. A jury chooses the winner. Could humanitarian action and development proposals work in this way, such that it allows for innovative systems approaches based on human-centered design? What if those affected were part of the jury? They can then participate in the design and selection of the humanitarian interventions for which they are the recipients. When I started this project, I was looking at doing sustainable shelters. It quickly became clear that South Sudanese homes are already sustainable and beautiful, made with skill and locally available resources. 90% of the homes in South Sudan are grass-thatched mud huts. What South Sudan lacks is not sustainable shelter. It is high ground for these houses and for their agriculture and their other school structures and storage structures. South Sudan is incredibly diverse, with over 60 different ethnic groups. Their Their tribal origins trace back to the White Nile. Each of these groups is defined by a host of ethnic, historic, and linguistic factors. The majority of the population live traditional subsistence lifestyles that are particular to their ethnic group. These livelihoods are usually centered on cattle herding or agricultural productions that vary from season to season and are often semi-nomadic. Agriculturalists tend to remain in a specific territory. Of course, cattle herding is very susceptible to the devastating effects of climate change. So this intervention begins to look at ways to be less reliant on cattle herding. Not to abandon it, but to be less reliant. The humanitarian community is collaborating with the government and international partners to leverage additional resources to strengthen longer-term resilience. This is the goal of my intervention. This is what the villages tend to look like now. The root causes that we are addressing are flooding, drought, and extreme heat. This is a humanitarian development, peace, triple nexus approach. A higher ground community addresses immediate physical and emergency needs while holistically incorporating development systems that are resilient and sustainable, addressing food security and building livelihoods. Communities which are housed, fed, secure are less likely to engage in conflict. Various sectors are involved: shelter, wash, food security, health, nutrition, education. The entire project, in essence, is a cluster approach and could be adopted by one or more multi-sectoral actors. It is essential, however, that international actors partner with local groups. The Sustainability Corps proposal is to build floodwater catchment reservoir, higher ground communities. They would secure funding for architectural and engineering blueprints, bulldozers, excavation equipment, fuel, transportation, in-country and external technical specialists, and all other logistical expenses. If local technical expertise exists, that will be prioritized. Otherwise, outside experts will be brought in to train locals as they work. Some of the assessments have looked at who are living in the camps and when they plan to leave. 78% of people want to move when all of their family can move. These are typical, on the left, typical communities that exist that are constantly flooded. The targeted communities for this intervention are those living in IDP camps from communities such as these, most impacted by river flooding. These occur in the states of northern Bahr al-Ghazal, Jonglei, Unity, and Upper Nile. The plan would be for traditional, societal, and familial groups of men, women, and children to remain together. Isolated and disenfranchised women with children may self-select and become their own communities of 150 or 200 people, as they already predominantly work in agriculture. This map shows the parts of South Sudan most affected by river flooding, where the people in the Bentiu camp here are all from. So these would be some of the areas we would target. From one of the assessments, it's interesting to note that one of their requests was for fishing gear, as they want to improve their own livelihoods. Part of the goal of this plan is to empower communities with ownership, pride, and dignity. Each community of about 200 people will attend to its own land, fisheries, and pastures, and have its own raised community. They will have several community buildings for schools, markets, storage, childcare, as they desire. Clusters of individual reservoirs that are built, anywhere from 5 to 10 reservoirs, will be connected by raised walkways. Communities The clusters can work together symbiotically and organically of their own making and of their own designs. The communities will combine agriculture, fishing, agroforestry, and cattle herding for resilience and food security. Individual groups in each raised ground community are fairly autonomous, similar to how most of these traditional tribes govern themselves historically. This is a plan of a higher ground community. This is the existing river. What we would do would be to excavate an inlet and excavate a reservoir. With the earth displaced from these excavations, we would build a berm surrounding the reservoir. On top of this raised berm, the community would then build their own homes just as they traditionally would otherwise, in their styles, in their organizations. There would be a spillway. So when the river floods, water would flood over the spillway and get into the reservoir. On the outside of the berm, the land would be terraced into agricultural terraces for crops. There would be raised walkways between one reservoir to another reservoir. Community structures would be located on the berm along with the houses. That was stage one. This is stage two. The idea would be to grade outlying fields in a patchwork system and slope to individual bioswales. This would all be done with the bulldozers. This helps drain the outside fields and creates opportunities for improved pastures and agriculture, which I'll get into shortly. Canals can be created for stormwater, and raised walkways can connect individual higher ground communities. Eventually, trees can be planted as trees slow down rainwater, absorbing excess water and reduce erosion. They also help to reduce the amount of water that flows into rivers, mitigating peak flooding. Trees also contribute to cooling through shade and evapotranspiration. Higher ground communities address flooding and drought. In normal conditions, once a reservoir is dug, communities can begin building their traditional structures on the elevated berm. During the flood stage, as water floods, the houses are protected, the crops on the terraces are protected. During a drought, when the river dries up, the community will still have water for domestic use, for agricultural irrigation, and the idea would be that each reservoir could be a fishery that each community can use. These are larger vicinity plans. Each of these circles represents a higher ground community. This is a river in normal conditions. This is a river during the wet season. And this is what it would look like after clusters of higher ground communities are built. In the dry season, rivers dry up entirely, leaving communities without water. In the wet season, floods destroy the homes. When higher ground clusters are built, this amount of clusters can support 4,000 people. And in a wider area, flooding would be mitigated due to each of these individual catchment basins. Therefore, these fields and pastures, graded with bioswales, will be far more resilient to floods and to droughts. Priorities from the HNRP 2025 Smart Survey wants to prioritize shelter, food security, and livelihoods. Shelter is prioritized through dry, passively cooled, permanent shelters, schools, clinics, and food storage. Food security is addressed through raised terraces for agriculture, focusing more on beans, legumes, and chicken farming. Livelihoods are supported through new fisheries, agroforestry, improved cattle grazing, and through grading and excavation excavation in and of itself. Higher ground communities would address heat through passive cooling. There are earthen tubes that can be dug within these berms where hot air within each shelter rises, pooling, creating a convection current, which pulls air that is naturally cooled from 57-degree earth into the shelters. Education is severely impacted by extreme heat. It causes prolonged school enclosures and increases learning losses, reinforcing gendered household expectations. Extreme heat worsens malnutrition, food insecurity, weakens immune systems. This type of passive cooling can make the houses on the berms much more sustainable, much more resilient to the heat. It can also create a cottage industry to manufacture the tubes. Homes, if there are local suppliers, these clay tubes can be locally sourced. Higher ground communities address food security and nutrition through the raised terraces. They are protected from floods. These can be used for agriculture, beekeeping, chicken farming. Reservoirs can supply simple gravity-fed irrigation for these terraces during the dry season. Looking at historic indigenous terracing that have been used for centuries. This shows the terraces during a flood. They're all protected. Higher ground communities will address additional livelihoods. It'll create new opportunities for fishing and aquaculture. There is some pioneering African aquaculture happening along the Nile further north. This is a much smaller scale fishery, and there are local NGOs working on fisheries in South Sudan. This is an example of one. They could work with these communities to turn these reservoirs into fisheries. Another livelihood that would be created through this intervention is excavation and grading contractors. As I mentioned, we would train local teams of excavators. Within 3 years, we would create worker-owned cooperatives that would own these bulldozers, and the bulldozers' ownership would be transferred to these cooperatives. All of these berms also create opportunities for construction of new and additional houses. Looking to more indigenous agrarian techniques, we can marry some of these with the modern equipment that these worker-owned cooperatives would have and create new opportunities for more productive outlying communities using canals, using drainage ditches. Looking at, for instance, Tenochtitlan in Mexico, which was a swampland, yet they managed to make it extremely productive through canals, irrigation. These are sort of the models I'm looking at when I considered this intervention. In the outlying fields, we would create bioswales. Bioswales collect the water. Year after year, they feed the aquifers, which make the fields much more drought tolerant. The tree roots would go further down and they would be much more resilient. There's a lot of agroforestry opportunities, and there are also agroforestry NGOs working in South Sudan already. Direct outcomes include houses, schools, other structures that are protected from floods, shaded areas and evapotranspiration for cooling, raised terraces for agriculture protected from floods, food security, reliable domestic water source during droughts, new opportunities for fish farming, raise separations between fields, double as roads, pathways, and serve as access during flood season. Indirect outcomes: improved welfare for women and children, improved livelihoods through fisheries, agriculture, agroforestry, resilient communities with food security, replenished aquifers, cooler microclimates, slower flooding due to vast additional tree planting and clusters of communities. Additional trees can also be sustainable building materials, renewable. The knowledge to continue building these higher ground communities, self-reliance, autonomy, dignity, local employment, retention of local customs and traditions, less violent conflict, improved educations, improved health, improved cooling. There's a plan for year 1, year 2, and year 3 that phases the work from the NGO to the community directly. By year 3, worker-owned cooperatives would be operational, ownerships of the bulldozers transferred. We would then look at, do an assessment, revise, adapt, consider another cycle. Year 1, year 2, year 3. Within year 1, 2,000 people could be resettled. Year 2, 4,000. Year 3, 5,000. In 3 years total, 11,000 people could be resettled. The goal is to use 3 teams in 3 different locations, each with 3 bulldozer excavators. By year 3, we can revisit scaling up and creating more teams. The rationale is there are already organizations aiding in the development of fisheries, rice farms, wash, and wells clean water. However, this intervention is unlike all others, being both emergency and anticipatory. It falls within OCHA priorities to take actions based on climate predictions to support vulnerable communities facing disasters. Catchment reservoirs such as these are a known sustainable development planning tool and increasingly used to mitigate floods and droughts. The scale of this invention is intentionally community-sized. Each reservoir is large enough to house and sustain a community of approximately 200 people. This scale is intentional. The need is great, so it is meant to address a large number of people, but small enough that the locals can be trained on the machinery such that all construction can be orchestrated by the community members themselves within 3 years. Larger countrywide infrastructure is neither in the budget nor does it provide the opportunities for food security and livelihoods as this intervention does. One goal was balancing an intervention size that has the ability to impact a large number of people but not require huge financial investments and be able to be transferred to the local actors. South Sudan is at a critical juncture. The choices made and productive social protection will be a particular now in navigating the transition, meeting humanitarian importance to the humanitarian strategy. Addendum. While this is a targeted approach that combats the root causes of humanitarian crises in South Sudan, it provides sustainable and HCD approaches to housing that address other needs. A projected global warming of 2.6 degrees centigrade will only worsen the likelihood and intensity of extreme climate events, exacerbating the conditions that have created this emergency. Even a sustainable local solution such as this will have a maximum capacity and will not likely meet the needs of an entire IDP population, and certainly not soon enough. No solution is therefore sustainable without considering the region at large, how habitable it will be in the future, and how many people it can possibly sustain given expected climate change. It is quite possible that even optimal solutions that maximize available resources, creating improved living conditions, livelihoods, and increase food security, will still not accommodate the current IDP population or the entire population of South Sudan. While South Sudan should move to radically improve its sustainability and build resiliency with projects such as these, it should also simultaneously be considering diplomatic solutions of voluntary external displacement of its citizens to ready locations such as China. The end.